All right, let's jump right into this explainer. So, when you hear the name Machiavelli, what immediately pops into your head? For most of us, it's probably, a ruthless dictator, some kind of dark manual for tyranny, or basically a how-to guide for backstabbing your way to the top. But today, we're going to look at a completely different side of Niccolo Machiavelli. We're going to examine his work not as some villainous political manifesto, but actually as a masterclass in systems engineering. Specifically, we're exploring his breakdown of the most stable, low-entropy power structures in human history. We're talking about the hidden mechanics of how power sustains itself, literally, without even lifting a finger.
It's a pretty profound question when you really stop to think about it, isn't it? Why do we accept the systems that rule us? The standard assumption is that holding control over, say, a massive population requires this constant, highly visible display of force. We always picture armed guards, super strict laws, the classic iron fist. But Machiavelli realized something brilliant. Relying on sheer force is exhausting. It's incredibly expensive, and ultimately, it's highly unstable. The truly invisible systems out there, they don't rely on coercion at all. They rely on something way, way quieter.
Machiavelli basically splits power into two completely different buckets. On one side, you have new states. Now, these are your volatile, high-entropy regimes. Think of a freshly conquered territory. To maintain control here, a ruler has to constantly apply force and coercion. It's a very active, super high-effort state. On the exact opposite side, you have hereditary states, inherited dynasties. These operate on incredibly low political entropy. They run almost completely effortlessly on the momentum of habit. Stability here isn't something the ruler has to actively create every day. It's inherited, and it's passively reinforced by time itself.
So how does this passive reinforcement actually work in our heads? Let's dive into Section 1, the psychology of control, looking at behavioral invariance.
Machiavelli is essentially exploiting deep biological human invariance here. There are three big psychological principles at play. First up, the normalization of authority. Basically, humans adapt to whatever power structure exists during our formative years. If a family has ruled for generations, their authority just becomes the background noise of everyday life. Second, the memory decay of alternatives. People simply cannot strongly desire a system of governance they've never actually experienced. The memory of what else could be out there just fades away. And third, loss aversion bias. Taking a massive leap into unknown governance feels vastly more terrifying than simply enduring a known, predictable system, even if it's oppressive.
And that brings us to this absolutely crucial point. Time converts coercion into reality. Read that again, it's so powerful. When a hereditary system persists long enough, it literally stops being perceived as a structure of control. The long-term ruling families, the nobility whose privileges are tied to that lineage, and the general public, they all just align. The system becomes completely invisible. It transforms from a political regime into simply the unquestioned status quo. It's no longer the way we're being ruled, it's just the way the world is.
This creates a really fascinating dynamic that we call the imagination lock model. And this defines exactly why these systems stick around. Spoiler alert, it's not because they're the absolute best way to run things. And it's definitely not because the population is perfectly happy. Hereditary states stay stable because prolonged, uninterrupted continuity actually suppresses a population's capacity to even envision a different form of governance. The alternatives quite literally become cognitively inaccessible. The rulers don't even need to bother banning other ideas because the population has completely lost the imagination to generate them in the first place. It's kind of mind-blowing.
But hey, psychology is really only half of the equation. Let's move on to Section 2, the architecture of power, focusing on system dynamics.
So all of this builds into a massive self-stabilizing governance loop. It kicks off with Step 1, stable rule. Because of that psychological adaptation we were just talking about, a long-standing regime faces very little pushback, and that leads right into Step 2, reduce rebellion. Because the resistance threshold is so incredibly high, there's no clear shock event to rally people together, rebellions just sort of fade out before they begin. Which brings us to Step 3, stronger institutional reinforcement. With no rebellions to fight off, the institutions of the state can embed themselves deeper and deeper, aligning perfectly with the ruling lineage. This institutional inertia acts as a massive self-compounding defense mechanism. Past rulers literally reduce the friction for future rulers, creating a system that practically runs on autopilot.
Okay, so if you're up against this giant engine that turns time into pure stability, how on earth do you defeat it? That brings us to Section 3, break a dynasty, strategic vulnerability. The secret here lies in a concept called the succession fragility model. You see, hereditary systems, They almost never fail from external attacks during their normal day-to-day operations. They are incredibly strong most of the time, but they are incredibly fragile during leadership transitions. Stability doesn't actually eliminate risk. It just takes all of that risk and concentrates it into a single, highly sensitive bottleneck, the passing of the torch. The succession process is the ultimate control node, and frankly, it is the single greatest vulnerability of the entire system.
And this brings us to the exact formula for dismantling the whole thing, the collapse equation. If you want to effectively break a dynasty, brute force just isn't going to cut it. Instead, you need two things to happen at the exact same time. First, you need a contested succession. You have to attack the clarity of the inheritance, maybe create competing heirs, or massively expose the incompetence of the current rulers during a crisis. Second, you need an elite cohesion break. Basically, you have to fragment the loyalty networks of the elite classes who prop up the lineage. Now, a strong dynasty can handle one of these issues, but both hitting at the exact same time, that triggers total systemic failure. The continuous narrative completely shatters, and the machine just breaks down.
So, you might be wondering, what does a 500-year-old playbook have to do with us right now? Let's get into Section 4, the modern era, cross-domain mapping.
Check out how universally this model applies across totally different fields. Like in trading, your hereditary state is a blue-chip, low-volatility market regime. The stability gives you these nice, predictable returns, but its big vulnerability is a sudden regime change event, super rare but absolutely catastrophic when it hits. Or in chess, the hereditary structure is a solid closed pawn chain. It's an amazing defense, super hard to break, but it's slow and it's incredibly vulnerable to a sudden positional disruption. And in cybersecurity, think of legacy stable software systems. They've got a hardened surface, predictable architecture, but their fatal weakness, outdated assumptions and single-point succession failures, like, say, a master admin account getting compromised. It's the exact same stability facing the exact same transition vulnerabilities.
Now, to be totally fair, we do need to call out Machiavelli's blind spots. The guy was a genius, but the engine of power he describes assumes a very specific kind of world. His model heavily relies on a low-information environment, a world where alternative ideas simply cannot spread. But contrast that with our modern reality. We live in highly ideological, extremely media-saturated systems. Machiavelli's perfect machine assumes a world without the printing press and absolutely a world without the internet.
And because of that modern reality, we're looking at completely new disruption vectors today that Machiavelli completely missed. First up, information modernization. The internet completely shatters that imagination lock. You can't suppress the cognitive awareness of alternatives when anyone can see 100 different ways to live just by scrolling on their phone. Second, meritocratic pressure. Modern society demands actual competence, not just the right bloodline, which heavily disrupts the easy transition of power. And third, structural economic decay. Look, even the strongest psychological conditioning is going to break if the economy collapses and people can't feed their families. So, in our high-information environments today, hereditary stability is actually incredibly fragile.
Which leaves us with one final, pretty massive thought to wrap up this explainer. Look around you. You know, we might not have kings and princes in the traditional sense anymore, but the mechanics of power, they haven't really changed. Time still converts authority into assumption. So ask yourself, what invisible machines are locking our imagination today? What corporate monopolies, massive ideological frameworks, or legacy institutions do we just accept? Not because they're the best, but simply because time and habit have totally erased our ability to imagine anything else. Keep an eye out for those succession transitions, guys, because that is exactly when the invisible becomes visible and the invincible finally breaks.